Episode 91, Restaurateur Extraordinaire and Hospitality Innovator, Will Guidara. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Will Guidara. Will is the former co-owner of 11 Madison Park and the NoMad, and is the co-founder of the Welcome Conference, an annual hospitality symposium. In 2017, 11 Madison Park was voted the world's best restaurant by the World's 50 Best Restaurants annual ranking. He has co-authored 4 cookbooks, was named one of Crain's New York Business's 40 Under 40, and is a recipient of the Wall Street Journal magazine's Innovator Award. His new book is called Unreasonable Hospitality: The Remarkable Power of Giving People More Than They Expect. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to actually start, if it's okay with you, with something pretty deep here. All right? What did you have for lunch?
I have not eaten lunch yet today.
You have not?
I have not eaten lunch. It's 12:35 p.m. on a Friday. And I just haven't gotten there. My day has not taken me to lunch yet.
Okay. So here, first of all, I hope this doesn't mean you're going to be all moody, because that's how I am if I haven't eaten. But kidding aside, I was curious, like, how much of a foodie you are, just given obviously what you do in your career.
So I definitely have a lot of guilty pleasures. I definitely love to eat well, but I'm not one of those people that needs every single meal to be a gourmet experience. In fact, I've found that sometimes, and by the way, I think this is a life thing for me as well. It's not dissimilar to if a song was full of crescendos, none of the crescendos would actually be a crescendo. I enjoy the idea of a simple salad for lunch or something like that. And when I go and I really decide to have a proper meal, that it stands out as being something a little bit more special.
Oh, okay. So, there's this growing trend. It's, 20 years in the making, right? But it feels like it's accelerating, which is this trend of, eating clean, eating healthy, and, being environmentally conscious with how we eat and all this. I know your former restaurant, became vegan, after you left. And I'm not asking you for a critique, on that, but just in general, where do you fall? I mean, to you, should food just be fun and enjoyable and relaxing, or do you feel like, is that really important that things are well balanced and they're nutritious and, we're not hurting the planet and on and on?
But I think everything in moderation.
Okay.
I'm married to a pastry chef. There's baked goods in my home all the time. If I don't approach my relationship with food with moderation, I would weigh about 350 pounds. I love a great cheeseburger. I also love a really healthy salad. There's nights when I'll have just a simple piece of roasted chicken, and there's nights when I'll order takeout Chinese food and binge watch television. I think the best. It's not dissimilar to most things. I think the best way to have a well-balanced, healthy existence over the course of a long-term basis is to approach things in moderation.
Yeah. Well, if I were married to a pastry chef, I would be easily twice my size. My willpower is, not bringing certain things into the house. My wife can bring in, she'll get these, these boxes of chocolate almonds. She could have those last, 2-3 months, having maybe, one a day, right? If I have one, I'm having the whole box. So I always tell her, you've got 5 minutes to hide this, or I'm throwing it out. Because if I don't throw it out, I'm eating it.
I can relate to that.
So I know you're probably as much or more of a service and hospitality guru as you're a foodie, and I wanted to brainstorm something with you. But before I do, I wanted you to share the story I know you've shared about this notion of what, great hospitality should look like. And it's the real estate agent that, you had talked about, and how what most of them do, and how what maybe someone did something a little bit different from others. Could you share that story? And then I'll tell you why I want to brainstorm.
Yeah. I mean, the title of the book I just released is Unreasonable Hospitality. And what that means to me is being just as relentless, being just as focused, as intentional, as creative, as unreasonable in your pursuit of how you make people feel, as you are with every other facet of the thing you do for a living. It's what got us to the top at 11 Madison Park. Every chef that had topped that list before us did so by being completely unreasonable in pursuit of the thing that they were serving. We, through being as unreasonable about hospitality, through giving our team the permission and the resources to be present with our guests, listen to what they were saying, come up with unique ideas and these gestures of hospitality where one size fits one. We did extraordinary acts to make people feel seen, to give them a sense of belonging, to give them the kind of memories that would last a lifetime. And I use the real estate agent as an example of how that applies to worlds outside of hospitality, or rather what's classically defined as hospitality, because I actually believe that any business can make the choice to be in the hospitality industry. Every time I bought or rented a new apartment, the real estate agent has, at best, left me a bottle of sparkling wine in the fridge as my thank you / congratulations gift. Now, this is someone with whom I've spent weeks, if not months, looking together for my new home. If they've been paying attention at all, they should know many, many details of my intimate life. And so imagine instead if the first time I walked into the apartment that I ended up choosing, the agent overheard my wife talking about the nook where she could imagine herself doing yoga in every morning. And imagine if the day we moved into that apartment, rather than the obligatory bottle of bubbles, in that nook was a brand new yoga mat and a candle with a note that said, "Welcome to your new home." Well, A, I think that'd be pretty cool. And B, compared to the average commission, it's a pretty insignificant investment in what will invariably become a lifelong relationship. Because to be clear, when someone gives you a gift like that, they show you that they care about you enough to pay attention and then do something with what they heard. And that's someone that you're going to work with forever.
So I love the story, and as soon as I heard it, it was sort of a punch to my gut, because I'm in this business of I'm a leadership advisor. I place executives, and when I place an executive, my congratulations is a bottle of wine or a bottle of champagne. It's the very thing where it's like, I don't even know if they like wine, let alone would appreciate a nice bottle, or if they drink champagne. And so I was thinking, like, what should I be doing to make, obviously I'm giving them, a change in their career, and, which is wonderful, but just in terms of a congratulatory kind of gift. Any ideas? Is there anything you did when you used to hire some of your leaders at the company?
Well, I think if what you're asking me is to give you an idea of what gift you should give people, well, no, obviously, because I don't know them. And that's the entire idea. If the point is that, like, the most gracious gestures are one size fits one, yeah, you probably know just as many intimate details about your people's lives as a real estate agent knows about their clients. And the fact that you're working together with that person to figure out if a real estate agent is figuring out, like, where someone's going to spend half the time, you're figuring out where they're going to spend the other half of their time. And so my thing is, if you feel a compulsion to give a gift, then give them a gift that's specific to them and the relationship you've developed. Because I'm sure that with 30 minutes of time spent intentionally reflecting on the conversations you've had with them and the things you've learned about them, that you're an Amazon click away from buying them something that would make them feel seen. And by the way, I just think it feels awesome to see their look when you give them that gift. I'd imagine the kind of people you're working with, they have plenty of really good bottles of wine in their cellars, and honestly, the bottle you're buying them is not going to make it into that cellar.
You're right.
And so
you're right.
You're almost fighting a losing battle to begin with if you're getting them wine. But also, we've all been given so many gifts of wine that it's a wasted opportunity to build an even deeper connection with the person on the receiving end.
Yeah. No, it's a fair point. I remember the story of when TBS, or Turner, I should say, hired Conan O'Brien way back in the day to be their talk show host. And all these talk show hosts, the late night ones, were all in the major networks at the time. And this was their first foray. And one of the people I interviewed early on in my podcast was Steve Koonin, who was running that division for Turner. And I remember the last gesture to try to close the deal was he knew that Conan was a big student of history, and Abraham Lincoln in particular. So Steve found some really coveted, picture of him, and somehow sourced it, and then wrote a note saying, "Let's make history together." And it's not that in and of itself, right? But just the notion that he knew something, he listened, and it probably meant a lot. The gesture of something that, is meaningful to someone. I think I just need to spend more time getting to know that aspects of people's lives so I can think about what might be appropriate besides like a new Tesla or something.
Well, yeah. And by the way, it's not the cost of the gift that counts. It's the extent to which it makes people feel like you care enough about who they are to get to know them well enough to find something that would mean a lot to them and perhaps no one else. Because by the way, if someone sent me a gift of a present of Abraham Lincoln, it wouldn't land on me, right? That has no impact for me. I think the reason it worked on Conan, and I love that story, I hadn't heard it, so thank you for sharing, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to people like that and asking them for things and asking of them because they like who they are as a professional without taking the time to get to know them as a human being. And I think one of our most deeply held needs as human beings is that we want to feel known and we want to feel seen, whether or not we're conscious enough of that fact to say it out loud.
So I want to go back to some of the early years and just, look at one or two moments in time that maybe shaped you. Your 12th birthday, I think it was, your dad took you to the Four Seasons for dinner. You describe it as this magical moment that solidified your life's calling. Is that really true? Was there something that profound that day that you really were just like it was an awakening for you?
Yeah, I think most people, when you have just this like deep rooted passion for something, you can often like find the moment where maybe it was not born all at once in that moment, but where it was most certainly a fire that was stoked to the point of not being able to put it out anymore. And that night was that for me, which I'd grown up in restaurants. My dad was a restaurateur. I always went to work with him because that was the best way to spend time with him. And he ran a company called Restaurant Associates, and one of their restaurants was Brasserie, which was right underneath the Four Seasons because they had once been owned by the same group. But through a few transactions, now they were right next to each other, but different. And I would go to work with him at Brasserie all the time. And the Four Seasons was always right above me. And it just felt like this magical world up there. And I finally convinced him to take me to dinner there. There's this quote by Maya Angelou, or often attributed to her anyway, which I think is the best quote ever about hospitality. It's people will forget what you say, they'll forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's true about that night. I don't remember many of the details of the night, but I most certainly remember how it made me feel, which there I was at this fancy restaurant wearing this blazer with the gold buttons that I insisted my dad buy for me. And remember, my dad was my hero. And for however many hours we were there, the rest of the world faded away, and all that was left was the two of us sitting across the table from one another. And it was not done by accident. It was done through intention. They created the conditions where that connection could take place. I've said many, many times to the people I've worked with since that in hospitality, we have this amazing opportunity, perhaps even a responsibility to create these magical worlds in a world that needs more magic. And although I wouldn't have articulated it like that then, that was the first time I felt it so profoundly. I was electrified being in that room, and I knew that I wanted to one day create rooms like that of my own.
If you don't mind my bringing up your mother, who was diagnosed with brain cancer. Yeah, when you were pretty young. How old were you when she first got diagnosed?
4.
But she didn't pass away until I think you had graduated from college.
Yeah, she passed away the day after I
Yeah,
graduated.
so just many, many years. That must have been pretty hard, I would assume.
Yeah, she survived initially brain cancer. They removed the tumor, but it was a malignant tumor, and the radiation treatment they needed to use to kill the balance of what remained ultimately rendered her into a quadriplegic. And so by the time I was 9, 10, 11, somewhere in that range, she couldn't walk or move or really talk. And the condition worsened over the years until she eventually passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, it's interesting. That was my reality from the moment, from as far back as I can remember, right? So it was never something that I thought was hard. That was just my normal.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, if I could go back and change history, would I? Of course. But I also think that there's these things that define who you become. My dad and I most certainly are much closer because of that. We had to, as a team, take care of her. I say as a team, he did a majority of the work, right? I was a little
Mm-hmm.
kid, but I mean, that experience shaped me for a couple of reasons. One, watching my dad, the integrity with which he navigated through that. He worked restaurant hours, but every morning he'd wake up, he'd get her out of bed, shower her, put her in the wheelchair, get her to the breakfast table, feed her, go to work for whatever, 12, 13, 14, 15 hours, come home, do it in all in reverse, somehow manage to be a good father and mom to me as well. Growing up in that way, I saw someone display such unbelievable graciousness and serve someone else with all of themselves. And that helped me understand how fulfilling a life doing that for others could be. But I also got to experience firsthand at an early age how good it felt to serve someone that I loved. But there was even a third thing, which was my mom couldn't walk or talk. And yet I've never felt more loved by anyone than by her, which shows in a really beautiful way the extent to which hospitality is not a thing we do. It's just a thing that we express. It's how other people make us feel through my mom's smile, her eye contact, just the energy she put out into the room every time I walked into it. She was an amazing mom. And so whether you look at it from each of those 3 angles, my dad always says adversity is a terrible thing to waste. That you can't control what's thrown at you, but you can control how you allow it to impact you.
Mm-hmm.
My mom's sickness most certainly played a big role in the person I've become.
You're very introspective that way. I actually lost my mother to cancer when I was in college. Uh, and it was a few years, so much shorter from diagnosis. But but to this day, still continue to try to go inward and understand what is it about that somehow shaped me and some of what I've done throughout my life. But you seem to have pretty much put your finger on it there in terms of you and how you've used that to shape a lot of your your future path.
I mean, I think anytime you lose someone that you love, there's a lifetime of unpacking, but maybe I had a head start.
I think it was like a week after her passing, you and your father were invited as guests to some really, really nice restaurant in the city. I don't think it was the Four Seasons, but somewhere really fancy. And it's just days after her passing. But, despite all the darkness and despair, for just this brief moment in time, this restaurant offered you this ever so slight ray of light that gave you comfort and joy, it seems. I guess back to your point about just the power of what, hospitality can do.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I think is so important for everyone, regardless of what they do, to take the time to articulate is why their work matters. I think if you don't understand the importance of the work, the nobility of what you put out into the world every single day, it's very, very hard to be the best version of yourself consistently, because man, sometimes days are really hard. We have lives outside of work. Maybe you don't sleep well. When you understand the importance of the work, it puts gas in the tank, and we all need the fuel to continue bringing all of ourselves to the table. I talk often about the nobility of hospitality, how we can help people celebrate some of the greatest moments in their lives, or how we can inspire people to be better versions of themselves through our attention to detail and our aspirations for excellence, or how we can make the world a nicer place by just being really nice to people. But I also think there's nobility in it because we can give people the grace to forget about their most challenging moments, if only for a few hours. Mm-hmm. That restaurant was Danielle, flagship restaurant of the legendary Daniel Boulud, who I'd met because he was a part of one of the classes I took at college. And he invited my dad in there literally, a week or so after my mom passed away. And during one of the saddest moments of our lives, we had 3 of the best hours of our lives. And I think that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Like when I talk to someone like you who, with what you do for a living, I'm sure there are people that do what you do that think they're in the headhunting business, as opposed to recognizing that, no, maybe that is the service you provide, but the hospitality you provide is so much greater than that, because you actually give people the ability to find happiness at work if you do your job as best as you possibly can. And we've seen, if you have a job that you love, the impact that can have not only on your life, but on the life of your family and your friends. I mean, you can legitimately change someone's entire life and the lives of all them around you. And my gosh, what a noble pursuit that is.
Well, thank you. I've never heard it quite framed that way, but we get paid by clients. I love my clients, but it's a two-sided equation. And if you don't care deeply, profoundly about these incredibly talented, leaders you're placing in roles, and you're right, it's not just their lives, but it's a ripple effect. Family, friends, employees, colleagues, etc. A lot of things change when you make a move. So, yeah, interesting way of putting it. Back to your dad. He posed this question to you. I was curious when he first did it, but I love the question, and you probably know where I'm already going, which is, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? Was that like as you were heading off, like, to school or your first job, or is that when you were like a little kid? He brought that up.
I mean, I don't know exactly the age he gave this to me, but I'm holding it right now. This is a paperweight that says the quote on it. I've had it for as long as I can remember. When he gave it to me the first time, it wasn't the literal asking of the question. Mm-hmm. It was him presenting an approach to take to life. Because, by the way, the answer to that question will change over time, given whatever season or stage you're in. The reason he gave it to me was because, in his words, too many people are scared to answer that question honestly, for fear that if they do, and they don't actually achieve whatever the answer is, they'll let themselves or those around them down. But if you don't have the confidence and conviction to answer it honestly and say that answer out loud, it's very unlikely that you'll ever achieve it. That idea, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail, if there was no chance of failure? It opens the aperture for the possibilities you'll consider. And often that answer, when you ask it in that way, and when you answer it like with profound honesty, is the thing that you're supposed to do. And here's the reality. Maybe you won't achieve it, but you'll get far further down the road just for having tried. And I keep it on my desk to this day. And I am a neat freak. I don't like stuff around. So there's not things everywhere. Mm-hmm. But because it's a beautiful, constant, gentle reminder to make sure that as I get older, and by the way, this is one of the issues with getting older and having a family, and suddenly you have a house or you have all this stuff, and we are less and less inclined to take risks. We're less and less inclined to take the leaps that are required to actually achieve whatever the answer to that question is. And so this is a gentle reminder for me to not let my age or the amount of things I have start to define my aspirations.
Well, I guess if I knew I couldn't fail, I don't have much of a voice. My musical talents are pretty pathetic, but if I knew I couldn't fail, I think you know where I'm going. I'd be touring all over the world right now, but I get where you're going. I do like the sentiment behind it. So if we fast forward to sort of the early phases of your career, you went to work for the great Danny Meyer. I think you were in your early 20s at the time. He was the original creative force behind 11 Madison Park, of course,
Yes.
along with Union Square Cafe, Gramercy Tavern, Shake Shack, just to name a few. He was known to create an almost cult-like atmosphere in his restaurants. What did you learn most from him?
Man, I learned so much from Danny Meyer. I mean, his approach to hospitality is the foundation upon which I built mine. I think there's two things that stick out in my mind right now. And if you ask that question to me at different times, the answer would probably be different.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, and the first one isn't something I learned, but more of the role that he played. I think it's very important to have heroes that do what you do, people who have achieved success and credibility at doing that thing. Because we need someone to look up to and to want to aspire to be more like. I've always wanted to be in the restaurant business, and I've never wanted to be the chef. I've always wanted to be the dining room guy. And coming up, there weren't that many people to aspire to be. And Danny was that guy. And so he gave me that gift, which was a very important gift to receive in propelling me forward towards my goals. But I think the biggest lesson I learned from him was the idea that language creates culture. Danny is famous, well, most certainly within my industry and within many more, because of the success of his book, Setting the Table, for his isms.
Mm-hmm.
He had all these like little phrases that helped put language to the ideas he was trying to convey to his team, such that we could all embody them and convey hospitality to the guest. It was be the swan, charitable assumption, constant gentle pressure, all these different things. And whenever you're leading a group of people, whether it's 30 people, 40 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, it's one thing to have a good idea. It's another thing to do the work to bring that idea to life. But both of those things are meaningless if you can't convey those ideas to the entirety of your team such that you're all moving in unison, rowing in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think far too few leaders and or companies take the time to articulate their core values, their non-negotiables, to come up with their isms such that they can communicate those things to the people they work with. When you do that, when you take that time and pursue articulation with intention, you're putting intention to intuition. You're taking these things that you do naturally and actually systemizing them. It's not dissimilar to when a baseball player goes to the tapes after they've had a good game to see what they did well, to make sure they keep on doing those things. Danny was extraordinarily good at that. And I've tried to emulate that since.
I always love hearing about inflection points in people's careers. And perhaps one of yours came when Danny gave you at the time what I imagine was an opportunity of a lifetime, to be an assistant general manager at some new restaurant he was opening. And again, I don't know if idol is the right word, but certainly someone you held in high regard. But you actually turned it down. And you turned it down to do, this is going to sound really sexy here, back office purchasing and accounting for some big restaurant group like your dad had been in, or maybe the same one. So walk me through, I mean, obviously always easy in hindsight to say how brilliant it turned out because it did, look at you. But at the time, what was the thought process?
I mean, the thought process was do what my dad tells me to do.
Was that his advice? Was that where it came from?
I mean, to be very clear, at that point in my life, and this was not because he was heavy-handed, but more because I had the wherewithal to invite him in to play this role. I would do what he told me to do. I think it's one of the issues with a lot of young people in their careers. And I most certainly fell victim to this once in a while, but I always tried to recenter myself, where you just think you know better, right? In spite of the fact that someone else has years of experience and wisdom more than you do. And so I always invited my dad to play a very significant role in the decision-making process around my career for until I was 26, 27, 28 years old. I'd been working for Danny Meyer. Danny Meyer is, arguably the best restaurateur in America, but he had 4 restaurants. And I was working at Tabla. The job you're talking about was at Blue Smoke Jazz Standard. That was going to be his 5th. And I called my dad so excited that I'd gotten the job offer to be the assistant GM there. And by the way, I was like, I don't know, 22 years old or 23 years old. Like, I was crushing it, right? To have that job at that age.
Yeah.
Like, that would have been the best thing to call all my friends from Cornell at the hotel school and be like, guys, look at me, And he made me say no, basically. I mean, obviously I had agency. I could have done what I wanted.
Sure.
His whole view is that as you're growing your career, you need to do 2 things. One, you need to make sure you have a very solid foundation if you have any aspirations to build a very tall building on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And only having, after college anyway, worked in the dining room was not a fully built foundation. He wanted me to understand purchasing and accounting and all this stuff, such that one day when I was running my own company, I could have enough knowledge and empathy for every single person that worked for me. But 2, he wanted me to work for a different kind of company. He used the phrases corporate smart and restaurant smart to articulate like 2 distinct approaches to running a company. Any company, honestly, outside of the restaurant business as well, so long as it has a corporate office and units.
I was going to ask you about that, actually. So perfect segue, because I think restaurant smart being, just to simplify, what's best for the guest, corporate smart, what's best for the bottom line, right? Effectively. And how do you balance those 2? So I guess this was your study of the corporate part of it.
Exactly.
And then later the guest part would come under Danny.
Well, it's what's best for the bottom line versus what's best for the guest. It's where the highest paid people are. Are they in the corporate office far away from the guest, or are they at the unit level engaging directly with the guest? And honestly, it's probably most succinctly put in a company's relationship and navigating the balance between controls and empowerment. And I did not want to take that job in the beginning. I went from wearing fancy suits and working the front door at one of New York's coolest restaurants to working 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. in an office building. But my gosh, I mean, that job was such an important part of my evolution, not only in the foundation building, but in showing me that actually the right way to build a company was to borrow bits of both. In the book, I talk about this author named Roger Martin, who's an amazing writer, amazing business strategist, who talks about the idea of embracing conflicting goals. And my story and the book is filled with conflicting goals. And most people, when they're faced with a binary choice, they decide which of those choices they want to make. And his entire thesis is that's actually an opportunity to pursue both simultaneously. And I'm glad I experienced both, because I was able to borrow what I believed to be the best from each as I built my own company.
So I want to talk about the restaurant smart part of it. You eventually make your way back to Danny and become general manager of 11 Madison Park. Eventually end up buying him out of his position there with your partner. But as you're managing the restaurant, trying to put your own stamp on it, you get a guest, which happens to be a food critic, that would later write a review that said that the restaurant needed a bit of Miles Davis. In the restaurant business, can make or break your restaurant, and you took it to heart. So you took the time to get immersed in the work of Miles Davis and what was he all about, and found him to be the source of inspiration. So what did you learn from that study, and how did that come back to manifest in the restaurant?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my relationship with criticism remains the same to this day. You have to read all of it, not the comment section of the criticisms, just the criticisms themselves. Anonymous comments start to actually be more hurtful than beneficial. But you also just can't change every time someone says something negative about you. I mean, if you stop reading it and you're in the customer service business, you risk complacency and irrelevance. If you try to change every time someone doesn't like something about who you are, you risk losing your point of view.
Mm-hmm.
The Miles Davis, it was almost a throwaway line at the end of the review, but it came during a time where, to the point of what I learned from Danny Meyer, I was craving language to articulate what we were trying to do. And when I read that line, I was like, there might be something there. And so we started reading everything we could about Miles Davis. And I think the three things that really stood out, we came up with a list of the 11 words we found most commonly used to describe not the music itself, but the approach he took to creating it. But the three words from that 11 that were most impactful, the first was cool, the simple word cool. I took over 11 Madison Park during a time when most of the really, really high-end fine dining restaurants in New York, all the old French ones, were closing and things were going the way of Momofuku. But fine dining is very, very important. We felt this responsibility to reinvent it such that it was no longer this old stodgy tradition, but if it didn't change, it would die. And in order for it to change, it needed to become cooler, more relevant. The second was endless reinvention. I mean, we would change often, just as Miles Davis did. Miles Davis was, someone whose musical approach changed dramatically and consistently over the course of his career, but never just for the sake of change. His music changed because he believed, as I do, that in order for the thing you're putting out in the world to succeed, it needs to be a genuine reflection of the people behind it. Miles Davis grew up over the course of his musical career, not dissimilarly to how I grew up over the course of my time at 11 Madison Park. And as I changed, so did the thing that I wanted to receive. And therefore, so must the thing that I was serving. And the third was collaboration, because Miles Davis is Miles Davis, right? But what people don't realize is a lot of the other incredible jazz musicians that people know, they came up with Miles Davis. He not only understood the idea that if he invited everyone in the band to the table to help create the music would be better, but everyone in the group would be that much more invested in making the music great, knowing that they had a hand in creating it. And he always supported the people he played with to go out there and find their own voice and their own success. And so those three things of that list of 11 were most certainly the things that I found most impactful in our evolution.
Interesting, which is a nice segue into leadership, which I wanted to cover anyway. Found it fascinating that, here you are, you're essentially trying to throw out the old rules of fine dining, right? This stodginess, maybe rigidity, pretentiousness. And you had this hiring philosophy of actually not hiring people with fine dining experience, or at least having a good portion of your staff that didn't have that, looking more for attitude and energy, as opposed to coming out of the finest, restaurant establishments. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, and I think the way I would say it is we didn't require it, right? Like, you could have experience so long as the experience didn't define you. I think we were trying to create a new approach. We were trying to do something different and new. And one of the issues with hiring people that have too much experience is they're too set in their ways. And before you can teach them new habits, you have to break the old ones. Not to mention the fact that what we were doing, the actual technical things we were asking people to do, I felt we could teach them those things. What was more important to me was hiring people that I wanted to spend time with, hiring people that had integrity, passion, a good work ethic. Not only that I wanted to spend time with, honestly, but that everyone else on my team wanted to spend time with. I think that you see this in every sports movie ever written. There's the really amazing, talented athlete who has a bad attitude, and then the team gets worse instead of better until that guy has this magical turnaround and has a good attitude, and then the team wins, right? It's almost like that script has been written a million times. I will always prioritize character over experience.
Although it's interesting you bring that up, because you seem to have this knack for learning about your people's superpowers, if you will. And, even for your most lackluster employees, putting them in roles away from where there was maybe, attitude issues or indifference. And, once you could take advantage of their strengths and where they draw their energy, suddenly it changes things around.
I would just say it's not although. I think that the two things play in concert with one another, because there's two types of people that struggle to succeed within an organization. Those that are trying but not succeeding, and then those that are not succeeding because they don't care. Those are two very different ones, right? The people that are trying but are not succeeding, those are the people that you really have a responsibility to spend time with, to figure out what their superpowers are, because they're good people. They have character. But for whatever reason, you have not set them up for success, whether it's because you haven't given them the right tools in the form of training or resource to do their job well, or because they're just not in the right role and their respective superpowers are not being seized on, and they're, by definition, not being utilized to the best of their ability. These days, with people having such a hard time filling jobs, I think if people spent more time getting to know their team, I think they'd really find a lot of benefit from it, because it's honestly, you take this person, you flip them, maybe suddenly they begin to flourish. Yeah, there's plenty of examples. The one I wrote about in this book is the guy named Eleazar Cervantes, who was a food runner who just wasn't passionate about food. And so no matter how much he studied, it's hard to learn about something that you don't really care that much about. But he was an unbelievably organized, respected member of the team. And there's a rule in a fine dining restaurant, it's called the expediter. They're basically air traffic control. They're the person that makes sure all the plates that are coming out of the kitchen get to the right person in the right order. It sounds simple. It's extraordinarily complicated. And it takes a very certain brain to do it well. And the more I got to know him, the more I realized that one of our weakest food runners could be the best expediter that I'd ever worked with. And that one simple shift not only made him much happier and more successful, but made our restaurant and everyone in it much happier and more successful. I often find that leaders have buried treasures throughout their team, and they just need to make sure that they find the time to grab a shovel and start digging in order to find them.
We're not at the ending of the podcast, but I usually end my podcast with asking guests how they define the word excellence, but you actually did it in the book. And I'm going to summarize here, which is you define excellence, at least in regards to hospitality here, as the culmination of thousands of details executed perfectly. And, many of these details, the guest may never even notice, but it doesn't really matter. It's creating this culture of excellence, as you put it, that requires attention to every last detail, regardless of how seemingly trivial they may be. And I think you mentioned intention before. I think it was your dad, once again, where you had originally learned about this, idea of intention, probably where you inherited those genes from, so to speak. I hope I'm not using a term that you don't like, but you're a perfectionist, which is like a major superpower of yours when it comes to what's needed to orchestrate these things.
Yeah, I think you're articulating it well. I think being a perfectionist can either be a superpower or it can be your kryptonite, depending on how you approach it. Because here's the reality: perfection is unattainable, especially in a human organization, because human beings, we know this about ourselves individually, and therefore it's easy to understand that it's true for everyone else. We're inherently imperfect.
That's not what my parents told me.
You lied to me. And so when I talk about excellence being the culmination of thousands of details executed perfectly, I talk about it for two reasons. One, because the moment you recognize that perfection is unattainable, you either let that drive you crazy or turn you off from trying to pursue it altogether, or you just decide to try to get as close to it as humanly possible. The idea of perfection, even if you're not a perfection, can be very, very overwhelming. But if you understand that while it may be impossible to be perfect as an organization, it is very, very possible and honestly very achievable to do many, 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 many things perfectly. And if you break an idea down into all of its thousands of parts and focus on them one at a time, it's remarkable how close to perfect you can become. The other reason I talk about it, though, like that, is I do think, like anything, to be successful in any pursuit, you need to create a practice in your pursuit of it. And when you can create smaller individual practices of excellence for yourself and for the entire team, you start to find yourself more organically and naturally being excellent. One of the examples I talk about in the book is when we set the dining room, I would have the entire team put the plates down, the chargers that sat on the table, in such a way where if the guest ever flipped it over, the logo on the back of the plate would be looking at them perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
It's absurd. For the following reason, how many people actually turned the plates over? Not that many. Of the people that did they turn them over the right way? Such that, I mean, because you can turn over a plate in many different ways, such that the logo would even be level? Probably even less. And of the people that turned the plate over and turned it over in the right way, would they even recognize the fact that the logo was perfectly even and looking at them? Even less. So whatever, we don't need to get into the stats, but a fraction of a percent. What it did before a guest ever flipped over a plate, though, is it put us in the mindset of excellence before a guest even walked in the door. And the moment you start to create practices like that, the moment you start to define how you and your team need to pursue even the smallest tasks, you collectively start to pursue the bigger ones like that as well.
It was this striving for excellence, which I think when you first started, it was a 2-star rated restaurant. It was just like a New York Times rating or something. Mm-hmm. And then over the course of time, as you'd put your stamp on it, from 2 stars to 3 stars to 4 stars. And as if that's not enough, you then get nominated. This is 11 Madison Park, of course, we're still talking about. The restaurant gets nominated as one of the world's 50 best restaurants. You ended up dead last. Now, yep. Quote unquote, last on a list of the world's 50 best restaurants. And, you mentioned this great wave of humiliation that you felt, but it was also the emotional fuel that you needed to then continue to climb and eventually, get to the top. I mean, well, as I'm sure you know, the honor to even be on that list. My God, the restaurateurs that would have switched places with you, it would be like an Olympian, one of the world's greatest athletes feeling humiliated because they didn't get a medal, even though to compete in the Olympics, you're one of the best of the best of the best in the world. So sort of a crazy standard, right? Wouldn't you say?
Well, I guarantee you, everyone that makes it as far as the Olympics is mortified if they're not on that podium. And the person that only wins the silver when they were so close to winning the gold, in the moment is probably not that excited to receive the silver.
Although I do hear the bronze medal winners are way happier than the silver.
I'm not surprised by that. That actually makes sense to me in a bizarre way. Perspective always takes time, right? But in the moment, defeats suck. And yeah, we were in, like, with time perspective, you'd say we're in one of the 50 best restaurants in the world. But in that moment, in that room, we were last place. And listen, I'm so grateful that we were, because were it not for that, I don't know that we would have had the ability to recognize the thing we needed to focus on to get to first place, which is the title of the book, right? Let's just acknowledge that the idea that there's one restaurant that's the best in the world is patently absurd. That's just not a thing. What being at the top of that list acknowledges is the restaurant that's having the greatest impact on the world of restaurants at any given time. And my gosh, that is a beautiful thing worth pursuing, right? Don't we all want to leave our impact in some way, shape, or form? And when I looked at the other restaurants that had topped that list, they'd done so by being unreasonable in pursuit of the thing that they were serving, the food that they were putting on the plate. Those chefs were unreasonable in pursuit of changing the game culinarily. And it became clear after the anger had subsided following that awards ceremony that our opportunity was to make our impact not based on what needed to change, but based on the one thing that never would change, which is the human desire to feel seen, to feel a sense of belonging, to feel welcome. If everyone else had gotten to the top by being unreasonable about the thing that they were serving, I felt like we had a real opportunity to be just as unreasonable about how we were serving that thing, about how we were making people feel about hospitality. Listen, we got on the list because of our excellence. We had amazing food, unbelievably delicious, innovative. Our service was as close to technically perfect as possible. The room was beautiful. But that wasn't going to be enough to have any real sense of impact, because there's a lot of really excellent restaurants out there.
And this is what I found so fascinating with you, which is you created this culture of excellence. You got the 3rd star, the 4th star, one of the world's 50 best restaurants. And which to me, clearly everything you did led to the higher and higher respect and appreciation and accolades that came along with that. But to have the wherewithal to say, hey, that was great. The culture of excellence got us to this level, but to take us to the next level, we need to now create this culture of unreasonable hospitality. Not to say that you shouldn't be excellent, but it's like completely, it's almost like, way back in the day, I don't remember how many majors Tiger Woods had won. And he was on a winning streak.
Yes.
When he then started to say, I need a whole new swing. It's like, what are you talking about? No, your swing. And you are the number one player in the world. Who would possibly mess with a piece of art when it's so perfect and clearly putting you at the top of it? But he said, yeah, but I assume he figured that what got him there wasn't going to get him to where he was going, and the game was going to change, and he had to change preemptively, which I love because what a big risk that is, to throw away, to some degree, if you will, right, the very formula that took you to that level, to say we need a different formula to take us to that number one spot.
Yes. And I think the important distinction is that it wasn't as if we stopped pushing the envelope of excellence. We just recognized that our impact would come from pushing the envelope of hospitality as unreasonably as we already were the excellence. Mm-hmm. And the reason it was a big change is because those two things are very hard to do simultaneously. It's not that hard to be a very excellent organization if you're unilaterally focused just on that. It's also not that hard to be a very hospitable organization if you're unilaterally focused on that. Doing the two things at the same time is what makes it challenging. Mm-hmm. Because like the very, very dumbed down example is like, and remember, it's a team sport, so it's how you're inspiring your team to follow suit. It's easy to have an excellence-focused team if you just scare them so much to not make a mistake that they're very focused on not making a mistake. The problem is when a team is so focused on not making a mistake, they're not going to bring their most fully realized selves to the table. Mm-hmm. It's also really easy to have a culture of hospitality because it's easy for people to be super kind and invested in the people they're serving if they don't have to worry about the details. It's when you choose to pursue them both relentlessly that you invite a lot of tension into the organization, because they're two things with competing desires.
So give like a couple examples of some of the changes you made that you consider unreasonable hospitality.
The first thing I did was kind of a transactional audit. I think things that feel transactional are the antithesis of hospitality. And so I just went through the entire dining experience from beginning to end and said, what about this feels transactional and how can I get rid of it? And if hospitality is in so many ways about making people feel welcome, I chose to start at the very beginning when we were welcoming people. Here's the reality. You walk into most restaurants, that moment where you should be like warmly embraced and your presence there should be celebrated. And the person responsible for doing that for you is standing on the other side of a physical barrier with the glow of a computer screen in their face, asking your name, stabbing around at the computer, telling the host to take you to a table number. Everything about that feels transactional. And sometimes the best ideas you have before you have any concept of how to execute them. I learned that from a magician. We got rid of the podium. I wanted it to feel like more like going to a friend's house for dinner. They throw open the doors, they welcome you by name, they invite you in. Mm-hmm. It was really hard to do that. It was unreasonable to do that. And actually, I take that back. It wasn't really hard to do that because there's a distinction between things that are hard to do and things that just require you trying harder to do.
Yeah.
It required us trying harder to do that. It required designing an entire system of sign language, building another podium that was hidden from sight from the guest, adding another maitre d' who used that sign language with the person that was there waiting for you. It required lots of small pieces of paper with Googled images of the people that were walking in the door with their names written underneath so that when you walked in, we could greet you by name. And this whole complicated system. That was a display of unreasonable hospitality. That one small moment, if done right, I believed was so important to the overall feeling that the guests have when they left at the end, that it was worth being unreasonable in pursuit of it. And there were many more that followed suit.
Can you tell the hot dog story? It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, for sure.
But before the restaurant became vegan, let me just clarify.
Before the restaurant became vegan. Yeah, thank God I got it in time.
All right.
That was kind of the breakthrough moment, because when I wrote the words unreasonable hospitality down after that ceremony where we came in last place, I didn't fully understand what they meant, which I think is fine. I think it's okay to pursue a goal without fully understanding its meaning, because once you start to pursue it, it'll reveal itself to you more and more along the way. And then one day I was in the dining room helping servers on a busier than normal lunch service when I found myself clearing appetizers from a table of 4 foodies on vacation in New York, heading to the airport to go back home after their meal. And I overheard them talking, and they were talking about what an amazing trip they had, going on and on about all the restaurants they visited. But then one of them said, yeah, but we never had a New York City hot dog. And it was like one of those cartoon light bulb moments where I ran back into the kitchen, dropped off the plates, ran outside, got a hot dog, ran back into the kitchen, somehow by the grace of God, convinced the chef to serve it. We cut it up into perfect pieces, made it look fancy. And then before their final savory course, which was a honey lavender glazed Muscovy duck that had been dry aged for 2 weeks,
little different.
I served them their dirty water dog. Yeah. And I explained it. I said, to make sure you don't go home with any culinary regrets, a New York City hot dog. And my gosh, they freaked out. You know, I've been serving lobster and caviar and foie gras and Wagyu beef and all this stuff my entire career, and I'd never seen anyone react the way that they did to that $2 hot dog. That was a game changer for me, because that's when I realized what unreasonable hospitality could be. By being present with that table, by being so focused on them that I stopped thinking about everyone else, I was able to pick up on that cue. By taking what I did seriously without taking myself too seriously, I was able to acknowledge that that was a good idea. If you take yourself too seriously, you start to let self-imposed standards stand in the way of you giving the people around you the thing that will actually bring them joy. And then, but the real game changer was this idea that in the same way that the picture of Abraham Lincoln would have no impact for me, but it was a game changer for Conan O'Brien, that hot dog would have actually had worse than no impact on other tables. It probably would have ruined other people's meals, but because it was specific to them, it was a game changer.
Did anyone look and say, hey, I'll have what they're having?
That did not happen.
Kidding aside, I mean, that must have been, I mean, back to the fact that you have these competing forces, right? Because you got to the top with excellence, which specifically around a lot of tight systems and structure. And here's exactly how the plates are going to be placed on the table, right? And everything's got to be just a certain way. But now the sheer nature of this unreasonable hospitality means that to create an element of surprise, of spontaneity, you have to let go.
Yes.
Because you can't do that. You have to enable your wait staff to be the ones to come up with how do you translate that. It won't be as tightly controlled, right? And so more freedom from them, less control for you. So I don't know, was that an easy transition for you?
It wouldn't have been an easy transition for me earlier, but I think that's the beautiful thing about light bulb moments. Suddenly things reveal themselves with clarity. I mean, it's not dissimilar to going to see a band, right? Like I talk about the Grateful Dead in the book because there's no 2 shows that they ever play that are the same. The music is less perfect. Mm-hmm. If they played every song the same every time they played, and they practiced the hell out of those songs, playing them exactly like that, the music would be more perfect. It's a lot less fun to watch. You know, like the reason that new culture, and what we did was I invited the team to start coming up with their own ideas to do that. I gave them the resources and hiring a position, someone on the team whose only responsibility was to help them bring their ideas to life, and put a budget behind it so that we had money to buy the kind of things that went into these gestures. The reason it was so successful was because it was a win-win-win. Okay, the guests were obviously happier than ever before. Our bottom line became stronger because when you're making people overwhelmingly happy, they tell a lot of other people, and then it becomes impossible to get a seat.
Mm-hmm.
But our team was happier than ever before too, which reinforced number one and number two. And they were happier for two very, very important reasons. One, they had creative empowerment. They were no longer just serving plates of food that someone else had created. Their own ideas were impacting the guest experience. And they were working that much harder to make the experience great because they had authorship in it. But two, we were all happy because we were making other people happy. It's one of the things that is an affliction across industry right now, is that people are struggling with burnout and depletion. And I don't believe there's anything more energizing than seeing the look on someone else's face when they receive a gift you're responsible for giving them. It is one of the fastest ways to fill your gas tank. People talk about this work-life balance, like, okay, maybe it's a 4-day work week and give people more time off and don't bother them on the weekends and all this stuff. But if the way you're trying to solve burnout in the workplace is giving people more time off in life, then life just becomes the place where you recover from work.
Mm-hmm.
And then what a waste. If you can create a culture of hospitality, then work, which is depleting at times, there's no way around that. Sometimes work just sucks and it burns you out a little bit. But if that same work can be the thing that re-energizes you and fills you up, then you're onto something. And I believe the best possible way to do that is through hospitality, through graciousness, through generosity, through creativity.
Well, it would obviously pay off, because I don't know how many years after you first stepped foot in that restaurant it was before you would climb that World's 50, and eventually you got the coveted #1 ranking. 11 Madison Park had been named the very best restaurant in the world. Curious how it made you feel, and did it feel as you expected it might feel as you were working your way up?
In the moment, 100%. Yeah, when you work tirelessly towards a goal that feels outrageously audacious and you achieve it, there are a few things that can feel that good. And then you fall off of it a little bit, and there's like always the depression that follows something like that. And then you decide what you want to accomplish next.
And how do you think about that? Is it, do it again? Or, because I know you're big into taking this idea of unreasonable hospitality, and which completely transcends the restaurant space, right? You could apply it anywhere and everywhere. So have you thought about maybe taking that formula and going away, or do you love, the whole food industry and culinary businesses so much?
I mean, in the space that I've had since I sold my company, I've recognized that I'm not in the restaurant business. I'm in the hospitality business. When I sold the company, I was almost desperately, frantically moving to open other restaurants, because as soon as I sold it, I started having an identity crisis because I didn't know who I was without a restaurant. And then one of the silver linings about COVID for me was that it interrupted that process, and it gave me the grace and the space to think about what I wanted to do next, as opposed to just running right back to doing the thing that I'd always done. Then I decided to write this book, which I wanted to do for two reasons. One, to share all of the lessons about service and leadership that I've learned over the course of a career in hospitality, because I do think that they're remarkable ideas in hospitality that could benefit businesses in every industry. And also because sometimes I think actually, like, forcing yourself to reflect on your past is a really beautiful thing as you try to determine what you want your future to look like. And so there was selfishness and selflessness combined in writing this book. And so now we're going to figure out what comes next. But I will say this, it's been really affirming for me in the only, 9-10 days since it's been released. I've heard from pediatricians and veterinarians and pastors, and we're in a pretty difficult time right now globally, and there's a lot of division. And I think if everyone focused a bit more on hospitality, it'd be a much better place.
I like that. I mentioned I end the podcast with this notion of what is excellence. And we sort of talked about how you define it, within hospitality, if you will, within being a #1 restaurant in the world. Just to transcend that, just thinking more broadly, any thoughts around the word excellence and what that means to you?
I mean, the way I answered it before, I wouldn't pigeonhole that answer to restaurants. That's how I think about excellence everywhere. But I talk a lot about the difference between excellence and hospitality. If I'm reframing the question to what is, in my current view, after learning everything that I've learned, the most excellent approach to take, if you are not being as intentional, as relentless, and as unreasonable about how you make people feel as you are whatever product you make or whatever service you offer, I think you're leaving extraordinary opportunities on the table. Because I feel very strongly about the fact that we were a manufacturing economy, we're now a service economy. I believe we're moving into becoming a hospitality economy. And the most successful companies will be those that put hospitality along whatever else they do at the center of every decision.
Wow. I like it. Look, I do this for a living, and honest to God, I learned a ton reading that book. I really did. And I didn't view it as this is just a playbook for getting to the number one slot in the world in a restaurant. It is what to do to continue to raise the bar. Will, a pleasure spending the time with you. Really, really appreciate it.
It was really good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You can do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.